Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another event with Take Part, the Portland Anti-Racism Team. I'm so glad to see everyone here tonight, and we are so excited to have Mr. Toby Asai Loftus with us this evening. We have just a few housekeeping things that we're going to go through, and then we will get rolling. The mission of Take Part is to confront racism and to engage in dismantling the systems that perpetuate ingrained racial inequality. We do this through events, education, and outreach that foster engagement in building a community where all people are treated with equality and respect. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the presentations at Take Part events are those of the individuals. They do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Take Part or its members. Take Part affirms that the Portland area is the rightful homeland of the Kathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook peoples, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and the many other Native people who live here, who have always lived here, and who have always belonged to and cared for this land. This event is made possible in part by the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Portland, and also by contributions from individual donors like you. We also work in partnership with the Association for Human Advancement and Development. Thank you so much to everyone who contributed to this event. We have a few communication agreements that we like to use at our meetings. These are just to give you a reminder of what to keep in mind as you're participating with everybody this evening. First, listen more, and listen even when you might be feeling uncomfortable. Engage tension, but do not indulge drama. The acronym WAIT, why am I talking? Consultation and collaboration, not competition. And finally, maintain a safe space for difficult conversations. Take away the lessons learned and the insights gained, but leave behind who said what. As far as how things will go this evening, attendees will remain muted until the Q&A portion of the program. If you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, we encourage you to use the chat box, and you will find a button for that at the bottom of your navigation screen in Zoom. So you're welcome to put any questions into the chat box as they come to mind. And during the Q&A, you will also have the option of going live on camera and asking your question directly. So whatever you're most comfortable with, we will be going back through the chat and finding those questions, or you can raise your hand during the Q&A portion and come on video and ask your question that way. Please keep your comments and questions concise and respectful. Tonight we have Mr. Toby Asai Loftus speaking about his mother's experience in Japanese American incarceration. Toby's mother, Mitsuko Mitzi Asai, was a fourth grader in Hood River when she and her family were forced to leave their home and sent to guarded relocation centers, first in Tule Lake, California, and later in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. Mitzi Asai Loftus received a BA from the University of Oregon in 1954 and taught at Creswell High School. She received a Fulbright teacher's grant to teach English as a foreign language in Shizuoka, Japan. Mitzi is the author of Made in Japan and Settled in Oregon, a memoir of her family's history that includes their experiences during World War II. Mitzi spent 47 years as an educator and raised 3 sons. Toby Asai Loftus has assisted his mother with many talks on this subject and has accompanied her on pilgrimages to the Tule Lake and Heart Mountain relocation centers. Before we turn it over to Toby, we'll have a brief opening comment from our board member, Bernadette.
Welcome. My name is Bernadette Janae, and I'm a Take Part board member. When I was in high school, I was obsessed with Nazi Germany. I wanted to understand how some people could be so cruel and inhumane, while others would risk their lives to show humanity to people who were being ejected from society. I was both outraged and appalled to learn about the arrest and incarceration in American concentration camps of Americans who happened to be of Japanese descent. As in Nazi Germany, entire families, including children, were forced into these camps. I met Toby Loftus because he and my husband both play with the Newport Symphony Orchestra. Toby's an incredible creative musician, blogger, and writer. And one day, Toby introduced me to his energetic 80-year-old mom, Mitzi, who just happened to drive up on a whim from Southern Oregon to hear his concert in Newport. I was so charmed. Soon I learned that though born in Hood River, Mitzi had been incarcerated as a child during World War II and had written a book telling her story. All people of color in America share generational trauma. I bought Mitzi's book, I read it, I attended her talks at McMiniman's History Pubs when she gave them. In February 2020, Toby filled in at the last minute for his mother for a presentation at the Kennedy School. He put together a fantastic talk in which he allowed his mother to tell her own story through video clips while he supplemented the story with his own words. During these troubled times, many people wonder what they can do to help others. You will learn tonight about the people who were helpful and not helpful to their neighbors. We're happy to share this presentation with you, and we hope you enjoy it. I'm proud to present my friend, Toby Loftus.
Thank you so much, Bernadette and Donna, and thank you, Take Part, for inviting me to speak. I'm very impressed with Take Part's mission, and I encourage everybody to watch the videos of past presentations. They're excellent. I'm humbled to be included, or to soon be included in those recordings. Thank you to my friends, my family members, and friends I have yet to meet who are connecting from all over the country tonight, and those who will be watching the recording. I believe we have folks here representing from Penn State, as well as from the Beaverton School District and perhaps some other schools of which I'm not aware. I'm not certain, but I believe we have 3 camp survivors joining us tonight. I can't see all the participants, there's so many, but I would like to make an special acknowledgement and thanks to Toru Saito, who was incarcerated at Topaz, Utah, Kenny Ina, who was born in camp at Topaz, Utah, and of course my mother, Mitzi Asai Loftus, who you can see has joined, and she was incarcerated at Tule Lake, California, and Heart Mountain, Wyoming. We are all honored by your presence here today, and I humbly hope that my presentation will do justice to your experience and meet with your approval. I will be talking for about an hour and 20 minutes, and I will be showing photos from our family and providing historical context. And I will be playing video clips of my mother from talks she's given in the past 8 years. I will often be referring to a list of resources, and I think that link will be posted periodically through the chat window and also on the Take Part website. It has links to many, many resources about this history if you want to learn more. As Donna stated earlier, if you have questions, please type them into the chat window. After I'm done speaking, I would be delighted to answer as many questions as I can. No question is off limits. I will stay as long as people want to talk, although I believe we need to shut things down around 9 p.m. local time. My mom has been sharing this history for as long as I've been alive, and my whole family is grateful to all of you for your interest in this important history. Over 120,000 people, 2/3 of whom were U.S. citizens, were incarcerated for 3 to 4 years without charge or trial. This is the story of my mother's family. So, who am I? I am the 3rd son of Mitzi Asai Loftus. Mom turns 90 in June, and here I hope you are seeing a picture of her. Is it coming through? Yes, thank you. This is a picture of Mom at Heart Mountain, Wyoming in 2019 when we attended a pilgrimage. She is standing in the approximate location of the barrack that she was forced to live in for a couple years. She hadn't been there, visited there in over 50 years. This is a picture of my grandparents. If they were alive, my grandfather would be turning 142 years old next week, and my grandmother would be 130. They arrived in the U.S. in 1904 and 1911, married over 50 years, raised 8 children, 7 of whom my grandfather delivered at home, and lived through the darkest period in U.S. history for Japanese Americans. I never knew my grandparents because Grandma died just a year before I was born, and Grandpa died a year after. Of the 8 kids, only my mom and her sister, my Aunt Mika, are alive from that generation. This is a picture from my Aunt Mika's 90th birthday 9 years ago. My grandparents are Issei. That is the generation of Japanese Americans who arrived, who came to the United States. Their children, like my mother and her siblings, are Nisei, U.S. citizens by birth, and the children of Nisei are Sansei. Since I'm half Japanese, I like to say that I'm semi-Sansei. I'm going to start off with a video clip of my mother describing the arrival of America of her parents, their marriage, and her birth.
And my father was 24 in 1904. He worked on railroads building in California and Oregon, and when he was working from Portland to the eastern Oregon line, he saw beautiful Mount Adams in snow on the Washington side of the Columbia River, and Mount Adams covered with snow on the Oregon side, and he says, "This is where I want to start a farm." So he bought a piece of land way up in the hills on a side hill where only a fool or Japanese person would farm. He had to cut down the timber, dynamite the stumps, sell off the lumber, plant trees. And in those days, they didn't have dwarf and semi-dwarf trees. So the trees would have to grow for 7 years before they bore fruit. And of course, my father was the son of a rice farmer, so he didn't know anything about fruit farming. And so he and my mother worked for other farmers to figure out how to be a fruit orchardist. My mother came in 1911, as did many, many women in those years, as picture brides. When my father bought property in Hood River, he said to his mother, "I'm ready to get married and settle down, have a family, so get me a wife." And I regret to this day to have not having asked my parents how many pictures he received, but I'm guessing he got 3 to 5, and he looked those over and said, A, it doesn't look too hot. B is too skinny. 3 looks kind of intelligent. I think I might go for her. Anyway, that's how he decided. And by this time, he was 29 or 30 years old because he had to work quite a few years to save enough money to buy the property. And my mother was 18 or 19, which means there was about a 12-year spread between them. They had 8 children, and my father delivered 7 of them at home. There's no way you can go to the hospital or get the doctor when you're way up in the Tules. So he had to do it. And we used to tease him and say, "You can't even find the can opener in the kitchen. How did you do that?" He could not deliver me because of complications in delivery. And he said my mother never complained through any of her deliveries. She just grabbed the bedstead until arms would go white and the sweat would pour down her face, and she'd never let out a peep. But when I was trying to be born, she said, "Kill the baby or do something." So he hooked up the horse and wagon and went more than 5 miles to town to pick up Dr. Chick and the nurse. And his worst fear was that one or both of us would be dead, but we both survived.
So this is my grandfather in 1904 when he was 24 years old and arriving in the United States. Here are my grandparents in 1911 when she arrived and they were married. Here are my grandparents with their two eldest children. In front of my grandfather is my Aunt Masako, and my grandmother is holding my oldest uncle, Uncle Tot, in her lap. Here are my grandparents at the original homestead with their two eldest sons, my Uncle Tot and Uncle Min. Here is a rare photo showing the two eldest and the two youngest of the 8 children. Flanking my grandmother is my Aunt Masako in white and my Uncle Tot, and in front is my mom. She was probably about 3 years old, and my Uncle Itsuo, or Dick. This would have been the only time Mom met Aunt Masako because Aunt Masako grew up and lived and died in Japan. She was killed during World War II, but Mom was too young to remember Aunt Masako. Here's a picture from Hood River. Mom's in the front there with my grandparents, my Uncle Tot, my Uncle Gene, and Uncle Dick. Mom's about 6 or 7 there. And now I'm going to let Mom talk about the fact that 2 of her brothers were already in the service when Pearl Harbor was bombed.
Well, the draft was on, and I don't know what was going on that we were having the draft in 1940 and 41, but they were boys were being drafted, and my one brother, my first brother, half, had graduated from Hood River High School when he was 15. And he went to work for the railroad, and during the week he'd work at the railroad gang and stay there, and on weekends he'd come home. And then he did that for 4 years, and he was 19 when he came home with a paper for my dad to sign, and my dad said, "What is this?" He said, "I want to volunteer in the Army, but I can't because I'm not old enough to be a volunteer. You have to sign." And my dad said, "Well, I don't know if I want to sign this." And he said, "Well, I'll forge your signature if you don't." So my dad signed it, and off I half went. And that was June of 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. So he was the first to go in. Next slide. This is my oldest brother, Tot, and he was drafted before Pearl Harbor, and they had to report to an induction center in Portland, which from Hood River to Portland was a good 2-hour drive back then. Right after Pearl Harbor, they also drafted Japanese-American boys, but since we were put on a curfew every night, we had to stay in our homes after 7 or 8 o'clock and could not leave our homes until 7 or 8 in the morning. And we had a restriction of a 10-mile radius. We could not be seen traveling in the daytime. And because they were drafted and had to report to Portland, which was more than 10 miles, and they would be breaking the curfew in many cases when they were moving, they had to have an escort. Each Japanese-American soldier had to have an escort taken to Portland to the induction.
So the curfew that Mom is referring to is the same one that Minoru Minyasui challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court and lost. Minyasui died in 1986 and was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2015. So here's my Uncle Half, who joined in about June of 41, and my Uncle Tot, who was inducted just, I believe, a week before December 7th, 1941. So where was my family on December 7th, 1941? Well, most of them were all at home working in the farm in the orchard, but my grandfather was downtown at the Japanese community hall. And the story about that is kind of a tragicomedy, and Mom will tell that story.
This is where my father was on Sunday, December 7th. He was down there with a group of people who were busily cleaning up the hall, getting ready for a big talent show that we were having to raise money for a flush toilet. We had, for a long time, had to walk down a long hill to the outhouses to do our business, and so they decided they'd like to install a flush toilet, and so they're raising money for it. Well, the police, the sheriff came and chased them all home, didn't explain anything, and my dad had no idea what was going on. And imagine if, to give an explanation, they said, "Well, we're going to have a talent show to raise money for a flush toilet." Well, they, of course, thought they were getting the place all cleaned up to have a big celebration over the attack on Pearl Harbor. So when he came home, he was all flustered, and we said, "We heard on the radio about the Pearl Harbor attack," and I could see the face. Oh my gosh.
So now I would like to speak about some of the political advocates and opponents of Japanese American mass incarceration. We'll start off with Attorney General for the United States Francis Biddle. Now he's a mixed bag. On one hand, his Justice Department approved warrantless searches of any household where Issei lived, quote, where the time is insufficient in which to procure a warrant, unquote. Hundreds of households were raided, but Biddle later admitted that little of note was discovered in these searches. On the other hand, Biddle clashed with military leaders who were calling for harsher anti-Japanese measures, and that prompted a nationally syndicated columnist to write, Biddle wouldn't be elected, quote, third assistant dog catcher in California, unquote, and that, quote, Californians have the feeling that he is the one in charge of the Japanese menace, and that he is handling it with all of the severity of Lord Fauntleroy, unquote. Biddle was the only high-ranking official in FDR's administration to oppose the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans. After the camps were built, he asked Roosevelt to close the camps, stating in 1943, quote, the present practice of keeping loyal American citizens in concentration camps for longer than is necessary is dangerous and repugnant to the principles of our government. Roosevelt resisted, though, and the camps weren't closed for another year. But Biddle wasn't immune to such prejudice either. In October of 42, he stated, quote, the Jap is in a class of his own. No one seems to understand the operations of his mind, and he becomes an imponderable quantity. In his 1962 autobiography, he regretted his part in the Japanese American removal and incarceration. He wrote, quote, I was new to the cabinet and disinclined to insist on my view to an elder statesman whose wisdom and integrity I greatly respected. He was probably referring to Secretary of War Stimson. He wrote further that, quote, decisions were not made on the logic of events or on the weight of evidence, but on the racial prejudice that seemed to be influencing everyone. Next is General John Dewitt, who was in charge of the Western Defense Command and leader of the Fourth Army. On December 19th, Dewitt advocated for the removal of, quote, all alien subjects 14 years of age and over. However, a week later, he opposed arresting all West Coast Japanese Americans. A couple weeks later, on January 4th, he stated, quote, I have little confidence that the enemy aliens are law-abiding or loyal, particularly the Japanese. I have no confidence in their loyalty whatsoever. I am speaking now of the native-born Japanese, unquote. Notice the words native-born Japanese. He is referring to U.S. citizens, like my mother and all of her siblings. He is making no distinction between them and alien residents who are born abroad. Dewitt opposed the plans to form the famous 442nd Regimental Combat Team that was made up entirely of Japanese American soldiers and went on to become the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. He stated, quote, there isn't such a thing as a loyal Japanese, and it is just impossible to determine their loyalty by investigation. It just can't be done, unquote. In favor of our incarceration, he reasoned, quote, the very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken, unquote. Ironically, my Uncle Half, who had been in the service for over 6 months before Pearl Harbor, served in the Western Defense Force, and so General Dewitt was at the top of Uncle Half's chain of command. Dewitt never publicly changed his mind or apologized, but it is interesting to note that in the waning years of his life, he joined the Japan-American Society of Washington. This is Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren, famous for the Warren Court that expanded civil rights, civil liberties, judicial power, and federal power, Miranda warnings, ending sanctioned school prayer, Brown versus Board of Education, and Loving versus Virginia, which struck down anti-miscegenation laws. Before he was on the Supreme Court, Earl Warren was the California Attorney General. He was a member of the American Legion and Native Sons of the Golden West, two organizations that often expressed anti-Japanese sentiments. He became a vocal proponent of the forcible removal of all Japanese Americans from the West Coast. When maps showed local Japanese American land holdings were concentrated near sensitive areas such as power lines, railroads, military bases, and oil fields, he concluded, quote, "Such a distribution of the Japanese population appears to manifest something more than coincidence. The Japanese population of California is, as a whole, ideally suited to carry into execution a tremendous program of sabotage on a mass scale should any considerable number of them be inclined to do so." Well, if you think about these land areas, they were both good for farming and undesirable in general, therefore available to Japanese to purchase. He believed that though it was possible to determine the loyalty of German or Italian Americans, quote, "When we deal with the Japanese, we are in an entirely different field, and we cannot form any opinion that we believe to be sound." And about that espionage that he was talking about, since even though there were no cases of espionage or sabotage activity by Japanese Americans, like Dewitt, Warren felt that this wasn't an indication that there weren't going to be any, but rather a sign that a massive coordinated activity was coming. Despite his later legacy supporting civil liberties, he never admitted error publicly. In fact, in 1962, he continued to defend the Supreme Court's disastrous decisions in Hirabayashi, Yasui, and Korematsu. However, in his posthumously published memoirs, he finally acknowledged his error. Quote, "I have since deeply regretted the removal order and my own testimony advocating it, because it was not in keeping with our American concept of freedom and the rights of citizens. Whenever I thought of the innocent little children who were torn from home, school friends, and congenial surroundings, I was conscience-stricken. It was wrong to react too impulsively, without positive evidence of disloyalty, even though we felt we had a good motive in the security of our state." Japanese Americans had an ally in First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. She spoke out publicly on behalf of Japanese Americans, citizens and aliens alike. In October of 1941, she praised the patriotisms of the Nisei who were joining the army in large numbers, like my uncles. After Pearl Harbor, she immediately flew to the West Coast to assess the civil defense efforts. She contacted the Treasury Department to unfreeze enemy alien bank accounts so that they could pay living wages. She publicly defended Japanese Americans and posed for pictures with Nisei, like this one. She supported efforts to find colleges willing to accept Nisei students so they could continue their education. On a national radio broadcast in January of 1942, she spoke on behalf of the Issei, whom she reminded listeners were barred from becoming citizens. Quote, "The Issei may be aliens technically, but in reality, they are Americans. And America has a place for all loyal persons, regardless of race or citizenship." She was taken by surprise by Executive Order 9066. She tried to protest to her husband, but he did not wish to discuss it. She tried to meet with FDR's friends and aides to argue against mass removal, but without success. She visited the Gila River camp in 1943 and expressed her sympathy for and apologized to the incarcerees for their confinement. After FDR's death, Eleanor Roosevelt was appointed U.S. delegate to the United Nations, and in 1946 was charged with drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ratification of which she considered her greatest achievement. So let's talk about Executive Order 9066. What it did was it granted the military the right or authority to designate a security area from which any or all persons may be excluded. I've bolded those words, any or all persons. It doesn't make any distinction about race, national origin, citizenship status, religion, no distinction. So under this order, theoretically, the military could say, State of Washington, for security reasons, all Methodists must leave. Idaho, people over 6 feet have to leave. There's no distinction here. It was this executive order that authorized the creation of the War Relocation Authority, the WRA, which was in charge of building the camps, rounding up people, and forcing them into them. And its director was Milton Eisenhower, brother to Supreme Allied Commander and later President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Definitely check YouTube, and that will be linked in my list of resources. Just search for Milton Eisenhower WRA, and you'll see this amazing propaganda film where he talks about how orderly and safe and everything the forced removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast was. So, Executive Order 9066, how long do you think it was in effect? World War II? 5 years? 10 years? How about over 30 years? Executive Order 9066 was rescinded in 1976 by Gerald Ford. He said, quote, "We now know what we should have known then. Not only was that evacuation wrong, but Japanese Americans were and are loyal Americans. On the battlefield and at home, the names of Japanese Americans have been and continue to be written in history for the sacrifices and the contributions they have made to the well-being and to the security of this, our common nation." So when Executive Order 9066 was signed, posters like these went up all across the West Coast. Instructions to persons of Japanese ancestry, and it was called the quote-unquote evacuation. What you can't see on this poster or in this image is that the directions were to all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien. What is a non-alien? It's a citizen. It's a citizen. How insulting is that? But let's talk about alien and citizenship. My grandparents had lived peacefully and legally in the United States for over 30 years before Pearl Harbor, yet they were not citizens. Anti-Asian laws prevented them from becoming naturalized. It wasn't until 1952, with the passage of the McCarran-Walter Act, that Asians were finally allowed to become naturalized citizens. By then, Grandpa was 72 and Grandma was 60. And the story is that Grandpa did study for the citizenship test and probably could have passed it, but he never took it. And the assumption is that he thought his wife, who had only a second-grade education, wouldn't have been able to pass the test. And I don't think his heart could take being a citizen without her. So they never became naturalized citizens. Now, this anti-Asian law that prevented them from becoming citizens is only one in a long line of anti-Asian laws going back a century earlier. Let's look at a few of those. An 1850 California law prohibited Indians, black people, or mixed-race people from testifying against a white person in court. An 1854 California Supreme Court case ruled that Chinese witnesses were included in the, quote, degraded and demoralized castes of all non-white people, and therefore they were too prohibited from testifying against whites. Oregon's 1859 Constitution prohibited any, quote, Chinaman from owning property in the state. However, it protected white foreigners and granted them the same property rights enjoyed by native citizens. Alien land laws propped up all through the United States and prohibited aliens from owning land. Those laws were not struck down until the Supreme Court cases in 1948, Oyama versus California, and 1952, Sei Fuji versus California. So what did my grandfather do? Like many, when he purchased land, he put them in the names of his infant sons. So my Uncle Tot and Uncle Min may have been 1 and 3 years old. They owned the farm because they were U.S. citizens. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 made legal Chinese immigration nearly impossible. In the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, Japan agreed to deny passports to Japanese laborers seeking to enter the U.S. The Johnson-Reed Act, or the Immigration Act of 1924, set a total immigration quota of 165,000 people from countries outside the Western Hemisphere. Now that may seem like a large number, but in fact that was an 80% reduction in annual averages from before World War I. And finally, the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934 promised eventual independence for the American colony of the Philippines, but at the same time, it strongly curtailed Filipino migration to the United States. So, the quote-unquote evacuation. The posters that were put up gave Japanese Americans on the West Coast very little time. I think it was maybe a couple of weeks to get their affairs in order and be removed from their homes. They could only take what they could carry, no pets. So you can imagine the mass chaos of 120,000 people trying to sell off cars and equipment, find people to lease their homes or lease their farms. And in that chaos, you can imagine the kind of swindling and gouging that Japanese Americans faced. So here you can see Japanese Americans loading onto buses. Here's a famous photo of a little 2-year-old girl, Yuki Okinaga Hayakawa, waiting to be taken to Manzanar. She lived until 2020. She died in March of 2020. Every person and every piece of baggage had to have a tag with the family number. My mom's family number was 16339, and this is a replica of that tag. So she had to wear a tag like this, and every bag had to have a tag. And if you watch the video clips I play of Mom, you will see many times she is wearing a tag like that to remember that. She'll never forget that number. Here's the Portland train station with Japanese Americans being loaded up to be taken away. Note the soldier leading them. Mom's family was in Hood River and transported by train. Mom was a 4th grade girl and really excited. This was going to be her first train trip. She'd never been on a train before. They got on the train and they had to close the blinds, and every train car had a soldier with a rifle and a bayonet. They had no idea where they were going, how long the trip was going to be, and how long they would be forced to be away from their home. So here's a map showing the progression of my mom's family. Note the dark black line going down the West Coast. That is the exclusion zone 1. So if you're Japanese American or had any Japanese ancestry and you were to the west of that, you had to leave. If you had a job or could go to school somewhere else, you could go there, but most people were forced into the camps. So Hood River, for those of you who don't know, is about 60 miles east of Portland. And so their first train ride took them down to Pinedale Assembly Center. They were there about 3 or 4 months. And then they were transferred to Tule Lake Relocation Center, just south of Klamath Falls, just south of the Oregon border. They were there for about a year. And then they were transferred to Hart Mountain, which is just outside of Cody, Wyoming, for 2 years. So what is an assembly center? Well, they had to imprison 120,000 people, and the camps weren't quite ready for that. So the Japanese Americans were put into quote-unquote assembly centers, which were old fairgrounds, abandoned army barracks. So for example, this is the Puyallup, Washington Assembly Center, which I think is part of the fairgrounds there. And in Santa Anita, they were put into horse stalls at the Santa Anita racetrack. I don't care how vigorously you clean a horse stall. In the heat of the summer, the stench was unbearable, and it was just humiliating. My mom's family was transferred to Pinedale Assembly Center, which is outside of present Fresno, California. And it was unique in that these buildings were actually built for the assembly center. So compared to some of the other camps or assembly centers, this was rather upscale. Most of the prisoners in Pinedale were from Washington outside of Seattle and Hood River, and a few from Sacramento. And it had a peak population of 4,800 people. It was very hot in the summer. And I think now is a time to start talking about euphemisms that are used to describe this period. Evacuation or relocation. You heard that term used in Ford's speech. I invite people to challenge these terms that people use to refer to these, this period. Evacuation is when you leave a place because of danger. Maybe there's a civil war or a natural disaster, hurricane or flood or something. This was not that. They were not leaving a dangerous situation. They were being forcibly removed. So I suggest, instead of evacuation or relocation, forced or mandatory removal, banishment, exile, or eviction. The people who were forced from their homes were referred to as evacuees. I don't hear that term as much today, but same problem. I would not refer to them evacuees. They were inmates, prisoners, or incarcerees. And as for assembly centers, when I think of assembly, I'm guessing that you, as do I, think of something benign, maybe an assembly for a charitable or church event, or a political event, or a high school pep assembly. You don't think of it as a place where you would be surrounded by barbed wire, armed guards, and searchlights. So instead of an assembly center, I would call it a temporary detention center or a temporary prison camp. Now I'm going to let Mom describe a memory from the assembly center of the searchlight at Pinedale.
This is a typical guard tower that's around the camps. There in Pinedale, there were 4, one in each corner, and every night there was a huge searchlight that you could see in a used car lot that would sweep over the camp. And although I was a happy child and had a happy face, I didn't realize how much these things were indelibly placed in my brain until I moved from Pinedale Assembly Center to Tule Lake Relocation Center, where there were no searchlights going around the camp. But as I lay in bed, I could feel it, because I used to count it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And when I got to Tule Lake, there was no searchlight, and I still was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's how the subtle influences of such things.
So I found a photograph of a searchlight from Pinedale. I have to wonder, is this the one that kept my mom up at night? After about 4 or 5 months, the Tule Lake camp was completed and my family was transferred there. This is a photograph of Tule Lake. You can see the rows of hastily built tar paper barracks and then the wide fire break in between them. I think we should talk about some more euphemisms. So the official name for these were relocation centers. And the most common term I still hear today is internment camp, and it's called internment. Now, I'm guessing that most of you, like me, have never heard the word internment except when referring to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. Now, internment does have a legal term. It means the imprisonment for political reasons or during a war. But I reject and challenge the term internment camp. Now, we did hear Attorney General Francis Biddle refer to these as concentration camps. FDR himself referred to them as concentration camps, and other politicians of the day did. Now, a lot of people are uncomfortable using that term. For most people, when you hear concentration camp, the first thing that comes to mind is the Nazi death camps in Germany. And with all due respect to my Jewish friends and brothers and sisters, concentration camps existed before World War II. They existed after World War II. And what happened in Nazi Germany was a horrific extreme where people were sent there not only for concentration camps, but to be killed. So I refer to those as death camps or extermination camps. If you're still not comfortable using the term concentration camp, may I suggest incarceration camp? I reject the term internment camp. And Mom and I may disagree on this. I disagree with other Japanese Americans on this. I do not like the term internment camp because I don't think people know what it means. And it seems too benign. And these were surrounded by barbed wire, armed guards, and they're forced to live there. So I invite you to challenge or reject the term internment camp. Now I'm going to let Mom describe a very vivid memory of these fire breaks. Oh, actually, here's some pictures. Here's that guard tower again. Here is a photograph of the census from Tule Lake, and you can see the names of my grandparents and some of my mom and some of her siblings. Here I am pointing to the barrack in Tule Lake where my family was forced to live. And that is the actual barrack, number 15 in block 67. And you'll see these wide fire breaks in between the barracks, and I'm going to let Mom talk about those.
And there's a picture of the camp on all the barracks, and you can see the fire breaks in between that they had, so that if these tar paper buildings caught fire, we wouldn't all burn up, you know. The fire break would prevent it from going across. And in the winter, we had snow blizzards, and going to school, you weren't allowed to wear pants then. If you're girls, you had to wear skirts and dresses. And to go across those fire breaks with a snow blizzard just coming against your legs, I would run, and I would crouch down, cover my legs, and then I'd get up and run some more. And I still have a very vivid memory of that.
So what was typical camp-like life? Here's a photograph of the interior of a barrack, and you can see through the open door the next barrack over there. The walls were very simple wood and tar paper, no insulation. Same with the floors, it was just wood boards, no foundation, no insulation. These were long buildings, typically segmented into 4 units, and each unit would have one single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling, one pot-bellied stove for whatever heat you could get out of it, and simple army cots. Any other furniture had to be built. And as you can see in this one, they've made makeshift shelves just from the boards in the wall. I learned at Hart Mountain that it took 57 minutes to erect a barrack. That's how quickly they're put together. And in the summer it was blazing hot. In the winter it was freezing cold. And in the summer with the dust storms, even if you stuffed cloth or towels under the door or in the windows, the dust would still come up through the floor. Everything would be covered with dust. This is a mess hall, and this is basically a barrack without the separate, segments in it. And this was where they had their meals. There was usually long lines waiting for food. There were lines for everything: the food, the bathrooms, the showers, etc. This is the camp commissary or store, and Mom remembers, for example, if fabric showed up, the word would spread through the camp, and people would rush in, buy the fabric. And a week or two later, you'd see people walking around with new blouses and shirts or skirts made with that fabric. How would you like to use these latrines for 3 years? No partitions, no doors, no privacy whatsoever. You could basically rub elbows with the person next to you. It was humiliating. And particularly for, say, some of the older folks, the older Japanese ladies, it was so embarrassing and uncomfortable that many would try to wait, and the same with the showers. There were no walls or partitions. They would try and wait to do their business late at night or wake up early in the morning. But that's not healthy. You can't do that. There are stories about people getting big pieces of cardboard and fashioning, kind of like wearing a box into the bathroom just so you could have some dignity. All the jobs on camp were filled by incarcerees. So doctors, dentists. Here's people doing the laundry. There was one job you could not do, and that was be teach. They brought in Caucasian teachers to teach the Japanese American children in the camps. Every day they would recite the Pledge of Allegiance behind barbed wire. Mom remembers this. And there were school dances and things like that. Now, after a year of incarcerating 120,000+ people, the government and the military said, it's costing us an awful lot of money to incarcerate and feed all these people. And we know some of them are loyal, and we really need some of the able-bodied men to serve in the military. This war is dragging on. We want to draft these guys, but how do we know who's loyal? So in their infinite wisdom, they came up with a loyalty questionnaire, which all people over 18 years old had to answer. Many of the questions were benign. What were your hobbies? Where were you born? But questions 27 and 28 were very problematic. Question 27. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces for the United States in combat duty wherever ordered? Well, that's kind of an odd question to ask my grandfather. He's in his 60s. He's lived peacefully in the United States for decades, but he can't be a U.S. citizen, and you're asking him to serve in combat duty. But question 28 was even more problematic. It's almost two questions in one. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attacks by foreign and domestic forces? Okay, so far. And forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization. What does the word forswear mean?
I had a rough idea. I had to look it up. Forswear means to reject or renounce under oath, or to deny under oath. So the government and the military were hoping people would answer yes to both these questions and thereby show their loyalty. But what if you answer yes to question 28? Couldn't that be interpreted as saying, yes, I swear allegiance to the United States, and I used to swear allegiance or had obedience to the Japanese emperor, but now I don't? My grandparents had lived for 30 plus years in the United States. They had no allegiance to the Japanese emperor, even though they weren't U.S. citizens. And of course, my mom and all of her siblings were American citizens. They had no
fealty to Japan. So it was insulting to be asked these questions. And these questions tore families apart, people arguing over them. I'm an American citizen. Clearly my citizenship doesn't count for much. Look where we are. We've been forced from our homes into these godforsaken camps. Mom and dad are aliens. They're probably going to be deported. Maybe I should answer no to help keep the family together. There are many reasons why people might answer yes or no to either of these questions. And if you answered no to either of them, they would call you in and try to persuade you to change your answers. Well, my grandfather chose to answer yes to both these questions. His opinion was this is not a time to be proud, and no good can come from standing up, saying no. And many people disagreed with him. All the people who were in Tule Lake who answered yes, yes, were transferred to other camps. And of all the 9 other camps, anybody who answered no, no was transferred to Tule Lake. Tule Lake became the worst of the camps. Its population swelled to 19,000 people nearly. And as you can imagine, if you have a camp full of 19,000 people who answered no to both these questions, they were a little bit more disgruntled. There were uprisings, there were protests, there were hunger strikes. They built additional guard towers, brought in additional military police, built a stockade where people were tortured. Those walls still stand today, and you can see graffiti scratched and written on the walls in Japanese and English. Now, for people who answered no, no, the government and military viewed those as disloyal and troublemakers. They didn't consider the fact that, you've been forced from your home and now you're in a prison camp, and now we're asking you to fight for us and swear loyalty to the United States. They wanted to deport these supposed troublemakers, but you cannot deport a U.S. citizen. So, Congress passed the Denaturalization Act of 1944, which allows you to renounce your citizenship. Over 5,000 Nisei renounced their citizenship. Now, if you renounce your citizenship, what citizenship do you have? None. You are a person without a country. Now, why would somebody renounce their citizenship? When I went to Tule Lake in 2014, I met some renunciants, and it blew my mind. Again, parents are aliens. They're probably going to be deported. Let's keep the family together. We'll renounce our citizenship. They said the war was only going to take a few months, and all the news was censored. Maybe Japan's winning the war. There are many reasons. One solitary ACLU lawyer, Wayne Collins, fought for over 20 years to overturn the renunciations, and he won eventually, and he is held with great reverence and esteem in the Japanese American community. So, Since my family answered yes, yes, they were transferred from Tule Lake to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. On that train trip, the train went up and through the Columbia River Gorge and happened to stop on the Washington side across from Hood River. And fresh Hood River apples were brought on the train. My family couldn't eat them. They were too heartbroken. Here's a picture from the census of Heart Mountain. And it's kind of rough, but in the middle you can see my family members there. Here is a map of the Heart Mountain incarceration camp superimposed over present-day farmland. And you might be able to make out a slight little ink dot in this top left corner. That was the barrack that my family was incarcerated in for 2 years. And that's from that first photo of Mom standing in the field. That's roughly where she was standing. Here's a picture from Heart Mountain. And again, you can see the rows of tar paper barracks with the wide fire break in between them and Heart Mountain looming in the distance. Now, what was Mom's experience like? This is an interesting question. Mom was a little girl. She was a grade school girl. She didn't understand the ramifications of what were going on. At home in Hood River, she'd have to walk 1.25 miles to school, 1.5 miles to church, and then come straight home and work on the farm in the orchard. She didn't have play dates with other kids. In camp, she had all these other kids her age she could play with and lots of free time. So she had a pretty good time. Here she is smiling with my Uncle Dick and Uncle Gene and Grandma, and that shadowy building in the distance is a guard tower. Now, for her older siblings and my grandparents, that was a dark time. How long are we going to be stuck here? Will we have a home to come home to? What is going to happen to the boys who are in the service? Are they going to be hurt or killed? But Mom had a pretty good time. Here she is in a Christmas pageant. She's holding a microphone on the right there, and she likes to joke that once given a microphone, she hasn't stopped talking. Thank goodness for that. She's unusual because many Japanese Americans who lived through this experience did not talk about it. They were silent, and sometimes their kids and grandkids never found out until after they died. Here's Mom sitting on the steps to a barrack with 2 of her friends. Now, in the beginning, the food at the camps was horrible. It was canned food, and I've read government reports stating that the food was unfit for children to eat. But large victory gardens were built next to the camps. So Tule Lake had a huge victory garden, as did Heart Mountain, and they raised fresh vegetables that were used to feed the incarcerees. There were actually some reports of townspeople complaining that the people in the camps were eating better. But actually, I believe these victory gardens produced more food than was needed for the camps, and actually food was offered to the local communities. This is a picture of the root cellar that was built at Heart Mountain. It is huge. You could drive, you can see literally a truck is being driven through it. This was constructed with wood brought in from nearby Teton Forest, and it was built by the Japanese Americans. And there's a big capital campaign to restore these root cellars so they're safe enough for people to actually go inside. They're very impressive. If you remember the O.J. Simpson trial, Judge Lance Ito's parents were incarcerated at Heart Mountain, and his father was instrumental in designing the gigantic victory garden outside of Heart Mountain. After 3 years of incarceration, it looked like the end of incarceration was looming. And now Mom's going to talk about how unenthusiastic Hood River was about having them return.
When we were in Heart Mountain, our hometown newspaper had a full-page paid advertisement every week. It just was a weekly newspaper then. And it had a paragraph or 2 of, "Japs are not wanted in Hood River. Don't come home. We'll make life miserable for you if you do." And then there were columns and columns of names of people we had known all our lives. The minister, the dentist, most of our neighbors, not all. And they had signed this petition, and there were something like 7 or 8 weeks of these full-page paid advertisements. And if you don't think that is frightening, discouraging, My mother was looking at those, and she was so frightened that when my brother Min said to my dad, my brother Min said, wait a minute, it might be too dangerous to go home. So 2 of my buddies and I are going to go to Hood River first and check it out. So Ray Sato, Sat Noji, and my brother, who were all in Chicago at the time, went home, and they were greeted at the train station with an unwelcoming committee who tried to put their baggage back on the train. Well, they stayed. And then my brother wrote to my dad and said, if you are planning to bring the kids, meaning me and Dick and Mom, home, you better come fast, because the Selective Service Department is going to change my Army classification from whatever it was that if you had 2 sons in the Army already, the next one was deferred, and he had been deferred. But they were going to change his classification to 1A so they could draft him and get rid of him, and that's exactly what they did. But Ray Sato had flat feet, or heart trouble, and Sat had whatever the other was, so they didn't get to send them off, just my brother left.
So this is a picture of my Uncle Min on the left that Mom was just referring to, and my Uncle Gene. So at one point, 4 of my uncles were in the armed forces fighting for the United States while the rest of the family was in the camps. But finally the day came when they were released from the camps, and my mom's family was one of the first families to return to Hood River. Here she is with my Uncle Dick, smiling at the Vocation train depot just outside of Hart Mountain. And when Mom and I went to Hart Mountain, we found Vocation Lane, where that train depot was. And in the distance, you can see the Hart Mountain Interpretive Center made to look like a barrack. And it is excellent. If you're ever in Wyoming, go to the Hart Mountain Interpretive Center. Here is an example of one of the unwelcoming newspaper articles. No japes wanted in Hood River. I had not heard the term japes before. It is a combination of Japanese and apes. And this wasn't Hood River, but this was a common sentiment up and down the West Coast. We don't want the Japanese to return. This is a Japanese hunting license, and I'm not going to read the words. You can guess from the caricature how offensive they are. This is a picture of the Hood River County Courthouse, and what you see there is the honor roll. This is a list of all the names of servicemen who are serving from the county, and there's quite a notorious story behind that, which Mom will explain.
This is a picture of the honor roll. I better tell you about that. How's my time, Toby? Okay. There was an honor roll in almost every town where they put the servicemen's names up. And in 1944, there were 16 Japanese-American boys' names up there, 2 of them being my brothers. And the American Legion Post erased those 16 names. And my brother, my oldest brother, was in the Battle of the South Coral Sea when the tide turned in our favor in the war, and he marched into Manila in the Philippines right behind the Marines who went in first. He got his first copy of Stars and Stripes in weeks, and he reads on the front page that his name was removed from the honor roll in Hood River, Oregon. This was really great for my morale. So I knew that those 16 names had been erased, and the first thing I did on April 20th, 1945, the day we returned from home, it snowed in Hood River. And I thought, uh-oh, this is an omen. But the first thing I did was to look at this honor roll to see if my brothers' names were back up. Because the American Legion, when they erased those names, Hood River, Oregon got national publicity for the first time in its history in the New York Times, saying they did this. So the National American Legion said, you put those names back. And they said, we're not gonna. And the headquarters said, you put those names back or you're going to lose your charter. And they said, okay, we'll put them back, but only because we don't want to lose our charter. So they did. However, they had scrubbed their names so hard off that the wood was rough and they couldn't paint their names back on. So they had to get little pieces of board and write their names on them and hang them. So the 16 names stood out from all the rest.
I would give my eye teeth to find a photograph of that honor roll with those names standing out. Now will be several videos back to back. First, Mom is going to describe why they had a home to come home to. Most Japanese Americans lost everything. My family was very fortunate that they had a home and a farm to come home to.
Go ahead. Okay. We were very fortunate in that my father owned 3 orchards when we left, and he had no mortgages. He had money in the bank. But a lot of the people had mortgages and no money in the bank. So if somebody leased their orchards while they were in camp and were not ethical and say, well, they didn't make any money, they went in the hole, according to the terms of the lease, maybe 60 or 70% of the profits they would keep and 30% was supposed to come to the owner. But there was never any profit. You know, nobody made any money during World War II. So that's what happened. But lots of people lost their properties because of that situation. We used to tease my dad and say, you're not Japanese, you're Scotch. It's a good thing.
So Mom's family was one of the first to return to Hood River, and now she's going to tell a story about how the WRA came to take photographs to use as propaganda.
There's my sister hoeing. Next. There's my father and my brother Gene showing the very nice fruit trees. And these photos were all taken by the War Relocation Authority, which was in charge of the whole program of taking us from our homes into the camps and trying to help us establish ourselves in our homes after we were released. Next. And there's my mother. Next. There's my mother and father in the fruit trees in Hood River, and my brother Gene. Next. Oh, and we found out that those photos were taken sort of for propaganda purposes, because the people who were still in the camps were afraid to go home, and they were not leaving the camps like the government wanted them to. So they were trying to give them encouragement to leave. So they took pictures of us like that, happily relocated in our homes. Well, what they didn't know is what we were going through, although these are happy-looking pictures. Some friends of ours said, oh, we saw these pictures of your dad pouring water on the tractor and your mom with a hoe and everything. They were put up in the camps to show the rest of the Japanese people they should get out of the camp and go home.
So here are those photos, or some of them anyway. So there's my Aunt Mika. There's Uncle Gene and Grandpa. There's Grandpa pouring water in the tractor, and smiling Grandma. And on the back of these photos is a stamp, War Relocation Authority of Denver, Colorado. And as Mom said, they looked like they were happily, resettled. But what was the reality? The reality was the vast majority of business owners would not serve Japanese Americans. They had large no Jap trade signs in their windows. This is a barber in Kent, Washington. But there were allies. There were a few treasured allies who helped my mom and her family and Japanese Americans. The Reverend Sherman Burgoyne and Mrs. Max Moore. Reverend Burgoyne wrote a scathing editorial denouncing the removal of the Japanese American names from the honor roll. Other wonderful allies were our neighbors, Carl and Hazel Smith, and Mom's going to talk about them.
Not all the people in Hood River signed that petition, but it came with great sacrifice. Our good neighbors, Carl and Hazel Smith, were 2 of about 8 or 10 people I can name to you today as people who stood right up and befriended us, called us up to see if they could do anything for us that we needed. But Hazel had a cousin who had the store 1 mile from my house that I passed every day on the way to school and on the way to church. And there was a no job trade sign in his window on the door. Ralph Sherb came to our house in May of 1942, before we left for camp, with tears in his eyes to say goodbye, and he gave us an address book and said, "Be sure to write me a letter." But when we got home, he had a no job trade sign in his window door, and I had to pass that every day. And when my brother Min first went to Hood River to check things out, he stayed with the Smiths because our house was not vacated yet. And so during that time, she went into the store, her cousin's store, and Ralph said, "Hazel, I don't like the way you're dealing with this Jap situation." She said, "Why don't you just come right out and say you don't approve of Min Asai living in my house?" "Well, I don't care to do business with you any longer," and she walked out. And she never had relations with her cousin, Ralph Sherb, until death. They both died.
So when businesses will not work with you, what happens if you have a severe need? Say you need a mechanic. Here's a story about that.
And we had a really hard time, especially with hardware and mechanic work, which for farmers was a real hardship. And our tractor broke down in the middle of harvest, and we figured out that it was the magneto. So we took it out, and I thought, well, how are we going to get the tractor going again? And my father said, "You know, Orman Hukari owns a machine shop on the corner of about a mile or two from our house. Why don't you take it down there?" It was my brother in high school and me who did all the business of the farm, because my mother and father stayed on the farm, didn't go anywhere, because the one time they went to town, it was so miserable, they just didn't want to face it anymore. So my brother and I went to Orman, because my father said when Orman was 5 years old, he asked my father if he could pick strawberries for him. My parents raised a lot of strawberries at one time. And my father said, "Well, you're too young, you'll pull the stems out," and so on. And he cried so much, my father said, "Okay," and he hired him. So he said, "Maybe Orman will help us." By now, Orman was Grand Exalted Ruler of the Elks Lodge. And when we got there, he said, I don't run the machine shop. I only own the building, and I lease it to this man, and I know he will not work on your tractor. But I'll tell you what, you bring it and hide it after dark, and hide it under the shrub in front of my gas station. And tomorrow morning I'll get it and take it to him and get him to fix it, and I won't tell him who it belongs to. We were so desperate, we did that. And then we went back every night after dark to see if the magneto would be under the bush. And each day of the harvest, it was just, we were frantic to get that tractor going. That's the sort of thing we went through. And there's good people like Carl and Hazel who, that's what you need to be, Carl and Hazel Smiths. That's my message always.
So I actually have cousins named after some of these allies. We will never forget them. So Mom has been talking about what was happening to the family. What was happening to her, a grade school girl?
So I walked to and from school, and every day, half mile down the road, Mrs. Spetsworth would be waiting for me. Mrs. Spetsworth is a woman who had 2 daughters who were grown and gone, and when I'd come home from school in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade, I'd stop at her place, play in her tire swing. She'd serve me a glass of milk and cookies. It was a very happy memory. But when I came home, she was at the road yelling at me, "Go back where you came from, you dirty yellow Jap." And she'd sick her dog at me. And I knew how obedient her dogs were because I've known her for several years before. I was so frightened. Every time, there was a deep ditch in front of her house, and I walked in the ditch because there were high weeds, and I thought, I was short, and the weeds were high. I thought, maybe she won't see me, but She was watching her clock, waiting for me every day. So every day in the morning, every afternoon on my way home, she'd be there to yell at me and to sick her dog at me. And I used to think, I wish that dog would just bite me and get it over with. But I decided I'd try to overcome the power of that dog. He'd come snarling and showing his teeth out at me, and I'd look straight ahead because I knew if I looked at him, he could see fear in my face when he would bite me. And I thought, if I run, it's going to chase me and bite me. So I decided I'm going to walk slowly and look forward. So I put one shoe ahead of the other to touch and do like this so that I couldn't go very fast. And the dog never bit me, but boy, I wish it just done it and got it over with. And so the power of the mind and the will to overcome a dog's bite.
So what was happening with Mom and her friends?
So that was happening. And what was happening to me? I was so excited about going home. I was 13 in the 7th grade, and I was going home to the place where I had all these friends I went to school with from the 1st to the 4th grade. And when I got home, I found none of them would have anything to do with me. So I walked a mile and a little quarter to school every day, back, alone. Nobody played with me at recess. No one would speak to me in the classroom except the teacher. And on Sundays, I would walk a mile and a half to the close enough church. And I would sit in a pew by myself. I found out because nobody else would sit with me. So instead of sitting in the long pews in the center, I started sitting in the short pews on the side so as not to take up so much space. But I sat there thinking, I'm going to sit in a long pew in the middle one of these days anyway. But I didn't do it. So it was a tough time for me in the ages 13 to 15. When I got to high school, I couldn't date, I couldn't go to the dances. I could, but there were 2 Japanese boys in the high school, and I didn't want to go with them. And if I did go with them, I'd have to dance with them all evening, and nobody else would dance with me. So what's the use? I had a crush on a Caucasian boy, and I thought for the Sadie Hawkins dance, there's my chance. But as I thought about it, because of the social pressures, he probably would refuse, and I would never know if he didn't like me or he was afraid, and I didn't want to embarrass him, so I gave up the idea. So I never went to a dance until I was at the University of Oregon. I had my first date when I was a freshman in the university.
Wow.
So it was during this time from junior high to high school that my mom decided I don't want to be Japanese. And she changed her name from Mitsuko, which everybody would say Mitsuko anyway, to Mitzi. Never told her parents, and she just did it. She named herself. So this last year, I had a strong compulsion to visit Hood River and see some of these. I've been many times, of course, but to actually visit some of these places that we're talking about. This is that hillside area that my grandfather cleared of all the trees and planted trees way up on the hill. The original farm and the original trees are gone. The original house and ramshackle barn are gone. But yeah, this is where it was. I decided too that I wanted to walk the steps my mom walked from her house to the junior high and to church. So here's Markham Road, starting from the new house that she was raised in. And here is where the Barrett School used to be. There is no, the school is gone. This is a house there. But this old building, this outbuilding, is from the original Barrett Middle School. I think it has a concrete floor that they used to roller skate on. A quarter mile further down the road is the church. And this is the exact same building that Mom went into, that nobody would sit next to her. And when she'd leave and the minister was greeting everybody, he would turn his head away. I believe it's a different denomination now, but this is the same structure. Walking home, I wanted to find Mrs. Bettesworth's home. Here's the deep ditch that Mom tried to hide from Mrs. Bettesworth in. The original house is no longer there. There's a new little house there. And I was very moved to see that there was a sign respecting diversity in the front yard. However, just a few houses down was a house with a very large Confederate Stars and Bars battle flag. In 1980, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, CWRC, held hearings and recorded over 750 testimonies from survivors of the camps. Many of them had never spoken about their wartime incarceration until that time. Many families found out about it for the first time during these hearings. The final report that came out of this commission was titled Personal Justice Denied, and the conclusion was that the decision to incarcerate was based on, quote, racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. So, how is this relevant today? Well, if you looked at the news during the pandemic, you know that violent attacks against Asian Americans is way up. But how about some more recent news? The pandemic relief programs ignored and excluded undocumented immigrants. Up to 74% of them are considered essential workers. They work, they pay taxes, and many of them have kids who are U.S. citizens. Does this sound familiar? Just a few weeks ago, a veteran news TV anchor shared that she enjoys dumplings on New Year's Eve. That's what Koreans do. A viewer responded saying that they kind of take offense to that. I don't think it's appropriate she said that. She's being very Asian. She can keep her Korean to herself. If a white person said that, they would get fired. Last month, a tenured University of Pennsylvania law professor in an interview stoked fears of, quote, the dangers of dominance of the Asian elite. Quote, I think the United States is better off with fewer Asians and less Asian immigration. The next 4 slides I'm going to go through very quickly, but don't worry, everything on those slides is listed in my webpage of resources. Online resources, if you want to learn more about this, there's the Densho Online Encyclopedia that has tons of photographs and personal testimonies of incarceration. The incarceration centers have websites and Facebook pages that you can check out for pictures, history, and current events. If you like podcasts, I cannot recommend highly enough the Order 9066 podcast. It is excellent and goes into great depth. And the QR code I have there is a link to my resources page, which I think is being posted multiple times in the chat log and will be on the Take Part website. How about places to visit? Visit the former camps. I've been to Tule Lake. I've been to Hart Mountain, Wyoming, just outside of Cody. And just a year ago, I finally went to Minidoka, which is near Twin Falls, Idaho. Even closed down with the pandemic, just walking around those spaces, I highly recommend it. The Panama Hotel in Seattle, especially the tea room, check that out. The tea room has a hole in the floor with plexiglass where you can see a storage room where Japanese families had to, in their haste, stored furniture and belongings. They've tried to return as much as they could to the families, but there's still quite a bit there. It's like looking at a window through time. Here in Portland, there's the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, formerly known as the Oregon Nikkei Center, Legacy Center. How about books? Well, there's tons of books to recommend. The award-winning Stubborn Twig by Lauren Kessler tells the story of Min Yasui's family, the Min Yasui who fought all the way up to the Supreme Court, the curfew. There's the novel about Tule Lake after it became the worst of the worst by Ed Miyakawa. If you like military history, Robert Asashina's Just Americans is an excellent book about the exploits of Japanese American soldiers in the Pacific and European theaters. Professor Linda Tamura of Willamette University has written many books. She may be online today, I couldn't see. She's taken many personal testimonies and accounts in Hood River, and this is just one of her books, Nisei Soldiers Break Their Silence. My uncles are on the cover, and my family is listed almost every 10 pages. That's not why I recommend it. Any book by Linda Tamura I highly recommend. The novel Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet by Jamie Ford is set in Seattle around that Panama Hotel about a Chinese-American boy who befriends a Japanese-American girl. And my mom's memoir, Made in Japan, Settled in Oregon, about her parents' arrival in the United States, raising their kids in the wartime area. Do not buy it online. If you find it online, it is a used, overpriced copy. Contact me directly at my website. I will get you in touch with Mom. She'll be happy to sign a copy for you. So what can you do? How can you be an ally? I recommend the Hollaback Bystander Intervention Training. How, if you see somebody being mistreated or persecuted, how can you safely intervene? LinkedIn Learning has some excellent anti-racism training. They are expensive. LinkedIn Learning is very expensive. Do not sign up for it, but go to your public library. Most public libraries will have a LinkedIn Learning account that you can use for free. The Innovation Law Lab is a wonderful crowdsourced group of lawyers, activists, coders, and translators who are working to help end isolation and exploitation of immigrants and refugees at the border. I have friends who have volunteered and worked with them. I cannot recommend them highly enough. Now I have my closing statements. I have 2 takeaway lessons that I hope you will take from this. The first is interview your elders. I never knew my grandparents. Grandma died before I was born. Grandpa, we have a picture of him holding me as a baby. I only know this history because somebody, my mom, wrote them down. Today, it's so easy. With your cell phone, you can sit down and interview your aunts, uncles, grandparents. What was it like? And be persistent. They may say, oh, it's not that interesting. No, be persistent. It's a great project for a child or a student to do, and you'll be so grateful to have those stories. And especially after they're gone, to have a recording of them. I'm so young. I wish there's so many questions I wish I could have asked my aunts and uncles, but it's too late. It isn't for you. Don't wait. Don't put it off. And my second takeaway is speak up for what you know is right. I trust your judgment. I trust the judgment of a grade school kid. If you see something that's wrong, speak up. Don't let anybody tell you your voice doesn't matter. It does. Even if you're only working with an individual. The allies of my mom's family in Hood River, you could probably count on 1 or 2 hands, and they will never be forgotten. And because this is the week of Martin Luther King's birthday, I think this quote resonates. Quote, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." I'm going to give Mom the last word here.
So my message is always, especially when I speak to high school kids, I say, it is not Mrs. Bettesworth and the dog that hurt me. It's the good people who knew when something was right and never said anything, never did anything. There were many people who befriended us in private when there was nobody else around except you and me. But if they saw you the next day in town, in public, they didn't recognize you. So that's what most people do. And I'm saying the reason I give these talks is to tell you, you need to change your ways.
I'm grateful and humbled for your attention and your interest in this history. My mom is here with me, or here online with us. Thank you so much. I would be delighted to answer as many questions as I can tonight if you want to do them in the chat window or live. If we can't answer all the questions, I will collect those and write the answers and post them. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Toby. That was amazing and moving and so rich with detail. To our wonderful attendees, this is your chance. This is your opportunity. You can either put your questions in the chat box, or you are welcome to raise your hand and we can call on you, and you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
No question is off limits. Were there any questions during the presentation?
Nope. No questions during the presentation. We do have a hand raised. Miss Victoria, you can ask your question.
That was just amazing. I actually have relatives who didn't make it out of the German concentration camps. And thank you for sharing this. I wonder if you have any information about the internment camp or the concentration camp that was right here in Portland. It was, wasn't it the old Hormel slaughterhouse that they converted into a camp?
I believe that may have been an assembly center. So the temporary center for 3 or 4 months while they were building the camps. Minidoka in outside of Twin Falls, they actually had to build their own camp. It wasn't ready. They had to come and build the camp in which they were incarcerated. I think the Portland one that you're referring to, I believe, was a quote unquote assembly center.
Mercury Music Studio has a question. Do you think your life would be different if your family hadn't been incarcerated? If so, how so?
Wow. Mom, do you want to unmute and talk about that?
Well, repeat again what was asked.
The question is, do you think your life would be different if your family hadn't been incarcerated? If so, how?
Oh, certainly. Let's see, I'm on.
You're on.
Okay. Oh, certainly. I would never wish that kind of experience on anyone else. However, I think it made me a stronger person. I think I was a fairly strong person, comparatively speaking, because of the influence of my parents. But I don't think, well, it's hard to measure the negatives with the positives. I'm glad I had that experience, as miserable as it was, but I certainly wouldn't want anybody else to have to go through something like that. It's a hard thing to say. And for most people, for many of my peers, they would say absolutely different. They'd say, oh no, it was terrible. I'd never want, want that to happen or happen to themselves.
I think it's also important to remember that Mom was so young that her experience of camp was actually a little bit more positive. She had kids to play with. She didn't understand the full ramification of what was going on. Her real trauma was after coming home and the persecution and isolation she faced. I think people who are older, like her older siblings and her parents, who were stressed about, will we have a home? Will our sons be killed in battle? What's going to become of us? I would suggest that would color Mom's opinion a little bit different than some of her peers. For me personally, of course, I did not experience this, but this is part of our family history and trauma. When I was younger, I used to get very angry and outraged when I learned about this history. But then I read about other dark periods of history, Black Like Me, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, People's History of the United States. There are many dark periods of history in our country, and it's so important that we remember them so that we can recognize the parallels and the repetition of these injustices, so that we can speak up and stop them.
I should comment on what my sister's response might be. She was 9 years older than I, and she was kind of like a mother to us 3 younger persons, because my mother worked out in the orchard all the time. And when Pearl Harbor was attacked, my sister had just graduated from high school. So her future was very bleak. She's thinking, I'll probably never get to go to college. I can't get a job. I'm locked up. What am I going to do? So my sister's response to the experience was totally different from mine.
Thank you. Sky, did you want to ask a question?
I would. Toby, thanks. And your mom, thank you both very much. I know that your family had orchards that were paid for when they got back to Hood River, but a lot of people lost their homes. They were in effect confiscated or stolen from them. I know that a lot of these injustices, it took a long time to get some of these laws off the books, as you mentioned, and for even relatively simple things like putting names up on a board. What happened in general? Did every state have a different reaction? Did some people get their homes back? Were there any kind of reparations?
Can I respond to that? In California, more people lost their lands because they were truck gardeners. They raised vegetables. In order to make a living raising vegetables, you have to have huge acreage. Whereas fruit orcharding, you could start with like 20 acres, like my dad had, or have 40 acres and feed a family, if you did a decent job of the work. And so the mortgages, they didn't have mortgages, they had to lease land. And so when it came time to return home, of course, if they didn't want them to come back, they had no place to go. So if you didn't own your property, like my father and most fruit orchardists, there you were stuck. You didn't have an income to pay income taxes, property taxes during the 3 years. And so you lost it on mortgages maybe, but otherwise there was a big difference, so that more people in California and some in Washington who were in truck gardening lost their properties for those reasons.
Yes, and from the Densho website, talking about this so-called Hood River incident, about the honor roll, the Japanese farmers had a smaller acreage and less fertile, less desirable land. But before the war, Hood River had some of the best apples around, and like a major portion of those were from Japanese farmers. So after they were evacuated, many of them lost their farms, couldn't come back, and so the population, the demographics of Hood River, I think Asian Americans, if you include mixed race, is only like 1.5%. There's a much higher Latino population than Japanese Americans. So Professor Tamura has researched this a lot more in detail than I have. So I would recommend you check that out in terms of the economic impact. And in terms of reparations, I think that's a good question. There was a decades-long political effort to seek an apology from the government and a financial reparations. And I can't remember what the year was, but it was in the 80s. And by that time, well, Mom was a 4th to 6th grade girl. She's turning 90 in June. So you can imagine that a vast majority of them had already passed away. But my mom received a written apology from the U.S. government. That is probably, for me, the most prized possession my mom has, because governments do bad things all the time. They never apologize. And I believe all survivors of the camp received $20,000. Now, that may seem like a lot of money, but when Mom talks to high school kids and said, would you be willing to be stuck in a godforsaken country behind barbed wire and armed guards and use the bathrooms where you have no, and all that sort of stuff, and eat crappy food for 20 grand? Not so much. And there was a debate in the Japanese American community. You can't put a price tag on that. That's crass. But one of the arguments was, you know how you make people remember? You make them pay.
We have another question for Mitzi. David Narita wants to know, do you feel bitterness over what happened? His father is still consumed by his camp experiences.
I do not. And I thank my father for that. He was a very devout Zen Buddhist, and without words, he lived his morality, his faith, and that he never criticized anybody verbally. I never heard him talk against or about someone else in a bad way, although I sensed in a couple cases how he was feeling and thinking. And I think that influenced me in the very best way, so that and one of his main lessons was, do not look back, always go forward. There's nothing you can do about the past. Only the future is where you can make a difference. And if you harbor negative feelings of grief, sadness, revenge, guilt, it will grow inside of you and kill you. And so that motivates me, so that I do not have, and I feel bad, I feel sad for my fellow Nisei, second generation people, and third generation even, who still have those bitter, angry feelings that they have to deal with. And I'm saying to you, David, is it, Mr. Nagata, to kind of explore a different path in your life.
My mom is unique. I've met many survivors of camp, and my mom is unique in that she talked about it for a long time, and many never did. Shikata ganai, it can't be helped. There's no good about talking about that bad period. And unfortunately, many people died before their family members even knew the details of what happened. So mom's unusual in that she's spoken up, and I think she's also unusual in that she doesn't have that kind of that anger and that resentment and that disgust, which I've seen and which is utterly understandable, particularly for families that were torn apart over the question of the loyalty questionnaire, for ones who said, we need to show our patriotism by serving, and others saying, to heck with serving, look at what they've done to us. Why would I want to do that? So I think it's absolutely understandable, that kind of anger. But go ahead. And David, it's wonderful to see you. David is my classmate from university. It's wonderful to see you, David.
We have another question from Shelley Wright, asking about Japanese Americans who were not incarcerated. Were they persecuted, and was it actually safer to be in the camp than to be in the community?
I'll talk, and then Mom, if you want to chime in, you can. There were certain communities that really wanted the Japanese Americans. There's a famous, I believe it was in New Jersey, a cannery that really wanted the workers and welcomed them. And so a lot of people who had lost everything went to New Jersey, and there's a sizable Japanese American community there because of that. Idaho really did not want the Minidoka. They were very resistant. The governor was opposed to it. And after they saw how hardworking they were, and they needed laborers because all the young men were off serving, they needed people to help harvest the crops. And Japanese Americans from the camps went and helped out to do that. And it won a lot of people over. There are arguments made that Japanese Americans were safer in the camps, and that may have been a reason to put them there. I strenuously and vociferously argue with that and disagree. And I have a link in my resources page to, her name is escaping me. This woman searched the records to find the military documents that argued for the military necessity and security to justify the incarceration, of which, of course, there wasn't. They found an original copy that was written up and sanitized that wasn't destroyed. There were 10 copies that were supposed to be destroyed, and one wasn't. And it clearly states that there was no military necessity to incarcerate the Japanese Americans. And I would suggest that since the conclusion of the committee that I talked about in 1980 was that the incarceration was due to wartime hysteria, racism, and a failure of political leadership, that if there was any danger to Japanese Americans, that's why.
Yes, and David, I'm glad you mentioned Seabrook Farms. That's the place in New Jersey where many Japanese people went. And as a matter of fact, when my husband and I took Toby and his brothers
and we're on our way to Europe, we stopped in New Jersey to visit the Norimatsus, who are a Hood River family, who are ones that went there and pretty much left, spent the rest of their lives in New Jersey. Yes, and oh, I guess I forgot what else I was going to say.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody who's raising your hand and asking questions. I'm just moving through them. Mitzi, we have another question for you from Bernadette. Could you talk about your brothers in the service and how they felt about serving while you were all incarcerated and how they were decorated for their service?
Yes, they never said anything about how they felt. I can only tell what they experienced. When in those early years, when a young man went through basic training, I think it was like 6 weeks or so, or 2-3 months, they got a furlough. And then half, my brother who went in June of 1941 was due for his furlough. And he wrote and said, my furlough has been postponed. For some reason, I'm being sent to the coast of California to guard the coast. What was that about in July, August, or September of 1941? My oldest brother then later was out of basic training, and he got his, he was getting a furlough after military intelligence language school that he went to. And no soldiers were allowed to visit the camps within that zone 1 that Toby drew a map with a line on. So we were, by that time, we were still in Tule Lake, so he couldn't visit us. We were in the no-no zone. So he had to wander around somewhere else visiting. And since Minidoka was in Idaho, outside of that area, he was able to visit our friends in Minidoka. And he was able to visit my sister, who happened to leave the camp to go to business college in Salt Lake City, but he couldn't visit us. And then he went overseas, fought in the Pacific Theater. And but my other brother then got a furlough, and by that time he could come because we were in Wyoming. Half came to Wyoming, and he stayed 2 days and disappeared. And my mother wept and said, what happened to him? Where is he? And he wrote back later, he said, I'm sorry, but I'm ready to fight, go to the Pacific Theater, and I have to visit my family in this camp. I couldn't stand it. So he left. So there was a lot of different situations.
So I can answer the rest of the question. And I have an anecdote story that I just learned this last year about my Uncle Tot. My Uncle Tot was in military intelligence and in the Pacific Theater. He would go ahead in the island hopping campaigns and speak in Japanese to the dug-in Japanese soldiers saying, give yourselves up, you will not be mistreated. And it was extraordinarily dangerous for him. In military intelligence school, the first day they said, well, about 50% of you are going to survive. It's very dangerous. You're either going to be killed by the enemy or by friendly fire. And one of the stories I heard was they got to an island where there were all these tunnels that Japanese soldiers were dug into. And he went in unarmed by himself, crawled into these dark tunnels, didn't know if he was going to hit a booby trap, to try and convince the soldiers to give themselves up. And his son said after that, nobody in the group questioned his loyalty. My uncles, for their service, were awarded posthumously, for most of them, the Congressional Gold Medal. I believe that was in 2004, 2006, thereabouts. I can't remember, maybe later. I believe that answers all the questions.
Thank you. Rebecca, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Hey, I am joining you from Eugene, and this has been a really tremendous presentation, so thank you. I didn't realize that Executive Order 9066 was so broad, and you may not know the answer to this, but I'm curious, do you know if there was ever discussion on the East Coast about sending German Americans or Italian Americans to camps. And I ask because I had German American relatives living in places called Germantown. And, you know, all they did was change their name from Fritz to Fred. And that's it. And I assume it was racism, you know, the difference in treatment, but I'm just wondering what type of discussion was had around that, if you know of it.
I don't believe that executive order was ever considered to be used against anybody except Japanese Americans. And I think the history would justify my assumption. There were some German and Italian prisoners incarcerated, but even in Tule Lake, my understanding was they had an awful lot more freedom. Even prisoners of war had more freedom than American citizens who happened to have Japanese ancestry who were incarcerated in the camps. Clearly, it's an awful lot easier to see the difference between a Japanese American and perhaps an Italian or a German American. But I remind everybody that there were zero cases of sabotage and espionage committed by Japanese Americans. The same cannot be said about other races or British or US citizens, Caucasians.
I have talked to some, and I don't mean a few, many people from the East Coast or even central United States who never heard a word about the whole evacuation, relocation situation, and they're shocked. When I give talks, there are people from those areas who say, my parents never knew, my grandparents never knew. No, and I was sad when my fourth grade classmates didn't come to say goodbye to me, but then I later thought, oh, well, they couldn't come. It was a school day. Well, it turned out, I found out later, they didn't even know we were leaving, that we were being sent away.
We have a question from Norm. Norm, I'm sorry, I've lost your question. The question was about Portland's strong history of racism and any relationship between that and what's termed the Shanghaiing of soldiers in downtown Portland during that time. I don't know if either of you have any knowledge of that, if there's a relationship there.
Well, there certainly is a very long and dark history of racism in Portland and in Oregon in general, as I alluded to the Oregon Constitution. The massacre of Chinese workers in the Snake River area. Shanghaiing, the only history about that I'm aware of is the Shanghaiing of people in downtown Portland. I'm not aware of anything related to specifically to the Japanese American experience.
Thank you. Robin, would you like to ask your question? You'll need to unmute.
There it is. Okay. Thank you so much, Ms. Loftus, for sharing your story. I feel so privileged to hear it from you, and recognizing that time is passing and there are fewer of you around to people who have been to the camp to tell the story, which is very grateful, just like people who were in the German concentration camps, all of it. So appreciate your courage to tell your story and your attitude of love. I have a friend who went through the camps and then she lost her home and ended up in Vanport, lost her home again. And I'm sure that quite a few people did. It's just the problems people live through. It's really hard to imagine. And thank you so much. I guess that's more of a comment than a question.
Thank you. We have another question for Mitzi. What drew you to church, especially when the minister was hostile and your father was Buddhist?
My father never expected, influenced, or encouraged us to be Buddhist, and there was no Buddhist church or temple except in Portland. However, I had the sense my father believed that to be Japanese was to be Buddhist, or to be Buddhist was Japanese, and to be American was to be Christian. So he did send my older brothers and sisters to Sunday school in the community hall that Toby referred to. On Saturdays, they would go there and learn Japanese language. And then on Sundays, they go to church, and the Reverend Isaac Inoue, who was a Japanese American minister, was a Methodist minister. So to this day, many Japanese Americans are Methodists. The reason I went to the church I went to was because I was so lonely, because nobody would interact with me at school or anywhere else, that I had to be around people. And so I went where the people were. And this church was a little bit past the school, so I was able to walk there on Sundays. I wouldn't expect my parents I wouldn't ask them to drive me to church. So I just walked every Sunday morning, and then every Sunday evening they had youth fellowship. So I'd go and both those places, nobody spoke to me except the teacher or the new minister who came a little bit later. My Sunday school teacher was the shop teacher at the high school, and he was very kind. And so that was my one weak, kind person to interact with. So of course I went to church every Sunday. And it happened to be a Christian church, Disciples of Christ, First Christian type church.
Thank you. And we have one more question for this evening. So if I haven't gotten to your question, please put it in the chat, and Toby will do his best to answer your question later. So this last question from Bernadette: what do you know about those leaders who were arrested early and separated from their families? Did any of them die? Were they tortured? Did they ever get tried or sentenced? Were they permanently labeled as criminals?
I don't know a lot of that history, but I know the answer is yes, that some people did die. I believe Min Yasui's dad, I think, was imprisoned. And of course, Min himself, I think, was imprisoned and possibly in solitary confinement for a long time. My grandfather in the camps went around collecting money to raise money for Min Yasui's defense. I don't know, but that is something that I'm happy I will research and try and provide some resources to.
I want to have not, because that Mr. Yasui was a close friend of my father's, and he was the first ones arrested and taken away, and he was not allowed to join his family for the whole war experience. And then he was not released from the whatever camp he was in until quite a bit after that. He finally was released and moved back to Portland. He thought he would never step foot in Oregon, or especially in Hood River, but he did. And he began when the naturalization law was passed to allow them to become citizens. He taught English and taught them how to pass the naturalization test. And then, of course, in the end, in despair, he hanged himself. And you need to read that story, Stubborn Twig.
Thank you. Folks, it's 9 o'clock. This was a fantastic presentation and a rich discussion. Thank you to all of you for attending and for participating this evening. Tremendous thank you to Toby and Mitzi for sharing these stories and this history with us. This is so important. This is not only our nation's history, but our city's history here in Portland. So thank you so much. We appreciate your participation and your support, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.